Hello and welcome everyone to the Friday evening edition of the group's Facebook Live. As with keeping with tradition, I have a. I'm just going to mute myself. I have a beer, so I welcome you to grab the beverage of your choice, whether that be tea, water, beer, which I recommend, or wine. We got a great Facebook Live coming up here. We have a special guest, Caitlin Burvey, who's actually the owner of Ignited Ink Writing. That's where she edits, creates video tutorials, and she writes. So she does have an MFA in creative writing, and she does teach creative writing at conferences, at schools, and at Colorado writing organizations where she lives. So let's all welcome Caitlin. And you are in my stream, and there you are. Welcome, Caitlin.
Hi, thank you.
It's great to have you here. Anyone watching this live, if you have any questions while we're going through this, or if you have a question now that wasn't brought up in the poll, definitely feel free to leave it in the comments down below. I am going to be watching the comments. I'm going to be looking over. If you see me looking over this way, I'm looking for different comments. So with that being said, Caitlin, let's get right into the questions. So what are the different types of editing? Educate us all.
Yeah, there are several different types of editing, and they go in levels and they kind of go in a specific order. So the first type of edit that you might have is an overall edit. Sometimes it's called a structural edit. And that's where someone reads your book all the way through, or your story from start to finish, and gives you thoughts, but they don't make comments in the text itself. So they're not like marking lines that you need to fix in the manuscript. That tends to be the least expensive of all the edits because it is just an overview, really.
Mm-hmm.
So then what most people are familiar with is the next type, which is a developmental edit or content edit. And that's where you're looking at the story itself. You're looking at characterization, at plot, at setting and pace, all the aspects of a good story.
Mm-hmm.
And when you're doing a developmental edit, you do get comments in the manuscript, and an editor will say something like, you need more characterization here, or you're summarizing this when you should be showing me this in scene, things like that. Okay. And that tends to be the most expensive.
The developmental edit.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Do you think that, and I know we're going to touch on this later on in terms of like, do you need them all? But do you think everyone needs that most expensive kind of developmental edit? And kind of what scenarios might there be where you won't need it?
So when you're doing the developmental type, most authors do need that because most authors don't have someone in their life who will read through the book from start to finish in a timely manner and has the skills and knowledge to be able to tell them what isn't working and how to fix it. So usually when you go to a critique group, they're getting pieces at a time, and those are the people most likely to have the skills to offer something like a developmental edit, but no critique group or few critique groups are going to go start to finish like a reader would, and they're going to get that good overview.
Yeah, so I see a lot of people, and I was just browsing Facebook because I'm trying to grow the group, and I'm almost, living in the Facebook group to be able to connect with everyone as much as I can. But I was looking on Facebook, and there's a lot of groups for beta readers and all that sort of stuff. Mm-hmm. And you see a lot of people reaching out like, oh, can someone read my 80K word book and give me feedback?
Right.
So those are the type of people that are kind of looking for developmental edit, but are looking for like hopefully somebody that is willing to read through it all and someone who is capable of giving good feedback.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And beta readers can be good at that. You just have to be careful because usually a beta reader is giving more of their opinion than an editor should. So an editor should tell you, this is the way to do this. You're not doing it this way, but it's still reading smoothly. Or an editor has been trained to say, this is not my taste, but it's right. A beta reader is probably not going to do that. They're probably just going to give you their opinion without that sort of exception.
Yeah. Okay. Without that sort of like, without giving their opinion, their like personal opinion, but they're looking at it like where you're doing a dev edit. You're looking at it from like, even though you're editing a science fiction book and science fiction might not be your thing, you can still appreciate the certain scenes that might be in it.
Right. And then too, as an editor, you've been trained to say, okay, how can I help them do what they're trying to do the best way that they can? Not how would I have done this? Because how I would do it doesn't matter. All that matters is how the author is trying to do it and how I can help them do it better.
Right. Okay. Good. And what's the next type of editing? So we covered, just to recap, what was the first type of editing?
The first type is an overview structural edit.
Structural edit.
And more often than not, when I get people who need that, there's someone who's like, hey, this is the first thing I've ever written. Should I waste my time revising? Or should I just move on and write the next thing?
Mm-hmm.
That's usually when I see people looking for that. Then the developmental edit. And then next would be the copy edit or line edit.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where people are looking line by line to make sure each sentence and paragraph makes sense, to make sure that they're in the right order, you're using the best word choice that you can. You're getting proofreading in there too. So you'll get people talking about your spelling and your grammar, and if you're using the correct there or their word.
Right.
That sort of a thing. And the copy edit should happen after the developmental edit, because you don't want to copy edit something that might be changed drastically. And that tends to be sort of the middle range as far as pricing goes for edits, because it takes more time than a proofread, but less time than a developmental edit.
Okay. Now, do you ever get, because you're a professional editor, do you ever get people looking for a line edit, but what they really need is a developmental edit? And do you ever go back to them and say, hey, you know what, I think we need or even a structural overview? Do you ever get that and you recommend to people, this isn't a copy edit, this is a developmental edit?
I have only had that happen a couple of times. And one time, the person decided to go back and approach their story completely differently anyway. And the other time, what we ended up doing is a developmental edit is usually done in 2 stages. You go through the manuscript once as an editor, make your comments, give it back. The author fixes it, they give it to you, and you do it again. So what I did with the other person is we did a developmental edit the first time, and then on the second round, we did the copy edit. And that worked for them because they were in pretty good shape beforehand. So they were able to kind of do both. Now, they still need a proofread afterwards, because I've read it too many times to be able to catch those little mistakes.
So right from the top, we have structural edit, we have developmental edit, then we have copy edit / line edit, and then the next one you hinted at
is a proofread. And proofreading is not the same thing as copy editing. When you do a proofread, you are just looking for mistakes. You're just looking at punctuation, at spelling. Is there a weird space somewhere? And about half the time, you're doing a proofread in something much closer to the format the book will be published in than you're doing for the other types of edits. So, yeah, and that's usually the least expensive because it's the least time consuming.
Right. And I guess the worst people to be your proofreaders would be the Amazon buyers, or the worst, I mean, I guess just editors in general, right? Would be the Amazon buyers. Those would be the worst ones because they can cause undoubtedly, like, it could cause the most amount of damage, right? Like having to take the book down. I've
Hmm.
actually seen that a couple of times. Speaking to a couple of authors, they had to take the book down and like just start from scratch, right? But
Yep.
you know what? Good on them for doing it and starting from scratch, and that's great. Um, okay, so those are the four types of editing. So proofreading.
Hmm.
Now I do have a question with that. Now, can you use the same editor? So full disclosure here. Um, Caitlin is now doing a developmental edit for one of my books, and she's tearing it apart, and I can't wait to see it. And it has yet to hit my inbox, but I know there's a little bit of a delay, but I have full trust in Caitlin. I can't wait to see it. She's going to tear it apart, and I love it. Now, once I make those changes for the developmental edit, can I also use you for the copy edit and for the proofread? Or is that sort of like you probably shouldn't do that because you've looked at it too many times?
Definitely not for the proofread.
Hmm.
For the copy edit, probably not. But when I do a developmental edit, I talk about a lot of copy edit things as well,
Hmm.
because to me, editing is teaching. And I don't see the point in waiting to teach you something when I can just teach you now.
Hmm.
So, depending on where we're at by the end of a developmental edit, you might not need a copy edit. You might be able to skip forward to the proofread. And proofreading is something that you don't want anyone who has read any part of your book to do. You want someone with completely fresh eyes. Because if I know what it's supposed to say, I'm probably going to see that instead of seeing what's actually there.
Hmm.
And it's kind of like those Facebook posts you see where they've written a word and they've scrambled the letters in the middle, but you can still read the word. It's kind of that
Mm,
same phenomenon that makes it hard to proofread something you've already read.
yeah. Um, so before we go any further, I just want to answer or propose a couple of questions to you, Caitlin, that have been asked in the Facebook group. So Julie, welcome,
Mhm.
Julie. Julie is from the UK, and I could imagine what time it is there. So I appreciate you staying up. Um, so her question has to do with Pro Writing Aid and Grammarly and other apps sort of similar to that. What are sort of its limitations? She finds that it takes out too many verbs. So what are the limitations between those and those kind of apps and editors, and how can they kind of maybe work together?
Yeah, so those type of apps are something that I would use for less professional scenarios with writing. So if I was writing an email, I might shoot it through one of those to see if it'll catch mistakes for me. But I wouldn't rely on that solely if I was going to publish a book or have it be out there in the world in that way. And that's because each one kind of has its own little quirk. So I've never used Pro Writing Aid, but it might take out too many verbs. You could be right. Grammarly, I find, has some weird things it does with commas. It puts them in places where you don't need them and it takes them away from places that you do. So
Mhm.
that's one of its quirks. So
Yeah.
they're all a little interesting in that way. And the thing that I will say that those can't catch that a person does is the exceptions to the rules. And when you're doing something for an artistic reason instead of for the technically correct reason. And then also like phrasing and passive voice, that sort of a thing, they're not as great at catching and understanding when you might need it and when you might not.
Right. So yeah, I use Pro Writing Aid and Grammarly because I mean, a lot of people know I also have a resume writing business. So I check that
Mhm.
out, or I run it through that. Just see sometimes, it's the same thing as writing resumes, writing books. Sometimes you completely misspell a word just because you've looked at it too many times, right? And it's just good at kind of just
Mhm.
picking that up, or even like the difference between what is really great, the difference between like UK and American spelling, like that type of stuff. So and
Mhm.
then we have another question by Judy. Thank you, Judy, for the question. So she wrote, where do I find an editor? Any good website to visit? Well, I can answer this one. Um, I can partially answer this one anyway. So Caitlin's website is Ignited Ink Writing. ignitedinkWriting.com, and I'll show you the URL of that at the end of this. But maybe Caitlin can talk a little bit about how do you how do you find a good editor to work with? What do you suggest? Like, say you don't edit your own work and you're a writer, you publish,
Right.
or you're about to publish a book. How did you find an editor? How do you recommend other people do?
There's a couple ways you can do it. The first thing that I would do is ask any writing friends that you have who published,
Mm-hmm.
who they used, if they were happy with them. Also pay attention to what type of writing your friend is doing. Some editors specialize in certain genres. Some editors, so I specialize in story-based writing, which means I do most types of fiction and memoir-style nonfiction, but I don't do a lot of self-help or technical sort of books.
Mm-hmm.
Other people specialize in that. Then you can go online. In my area, we have a group called the Boulder Writers, and that's a town near where I live. And there's about 30 of us, and we have a website, so you can go and look at the different editors, see which one kind of aligns with your personality, what you're looking for. You can ask on Facebook too, and you can always ask for a sample edit. I give one of those for free for larger projects. It's short, it's 5 to 7 pages-ish, and it's just a way for us to kind of get to know each other as editor and writer and see if we're a good fit. So it's definitely okay to ask for something like that too.
Okay. So maybe a good way would be like not to use up 15 editors times, but like maybe pick 2 or 3 that you feel like you might have a good connection with, ask for a sample edit, and then kind of just take it from there.
Definitely. And then remember too, you might need more than one. So you might be asking for a sample developmental edit and a sample proofread or something like that.
Right. Okay. And then there's a third question that just came in from Jessica. Thank you, Jessica, for the question. She's looking for basically some recommended alternatives for the poor, starving folk like me. So she writes 80 to 100K word books. Are there decent options for indie authors like me? So I guess that kind of takes us into our next question, which is kind of, do you need them all? And really kind of combined, like how can people save money on editing? Because I'll go on like just a little bit of a rant. Like I know some people are kind of constrained by budget, but I also know that like editors, especially good editors, are like definitely worth their money, and I know how much like time it is to kind of put into it, right? And I think a lot of people do appreciate that, like how much time it takes you to do a developmental edit for me, right? Like how many hours it takes for you to put in, right? But I can also appreciate people's budgetary constraints. So what do you kind of recommend for those people?
So there are a couple of ways to approach this. First, if you have a good writer's critique group, they're going to catch a lot of things that an editor would also catch. So that's a great place to start. I will say again, they're probably not going to get through your whole book in one sitting like a reader. So that overall structure is one area where a critique group might let you down. You can trade. So if you have another author who is ready for some edits and you both have similar skills for giving feedback, you can trade. I did that with my first novel, which is not published because life happened. But there were 4 of us, and we all had novels ready over one summer. So we did it 1 month at a time. We do one person's book, and 2 of us were editors in that group. So that novel I would not do a developmental edit on because it has already had one. So those are great options. I will say, just because someone's a writer doesn't mean they're an editor. So vet them a little bit that way too. Trade a chapter first. See if you agree with their feedback, if they deliver it in a way you can digest, that sort of a thing.
So you could do like a sample edit with them.
Right. You can.
Yeah.
And that can be a great alternative. If you're writing short stories, this is something Dennis and I have talked about. My book that's coming out is a collection of short stories, and I actually gave it to a developmental editor who's a friend, and I was going to use her. And she's like, yeah, this doesn't need me. And that's because each short story had gone through 2 of my critique groups. And when it's a short story, they can see the whole thing or like half at a time.
Mm-hmm.
So it gets that overall edit that I couldn't get for a novel. Then some people, like we were talking about earlier, if you draft your sentences well, so when you're first writing,
Mm-hmm.
you have a good grasp of the English language and you're drafting with punctuation and all of the things that you should need, usually you don't need as much of a copy edit because you've done it already. And so sometimes you can skip the copy edit and just have a proofread. You might still need the developmental part, but you can kind of skip that one. I will say everyone needs a proofreader, no matter how good you are.
Mm-hmm.
I'll also say, and some of my editor friends would be mad at me, you don't have to be a professional editor to be a proofreader.
Mm-hmm.
That is one time where if you know someone who's just really good at the English language, that's the part they can help you with. They're not going to be trained in story techniques and creative writing, but they know where commas go. They know how words should be spelled. So you can save money there if you have someone in your life who was an English major and always catches those things. Maybe you'll use them as your proofreader.
Mm-hmm.
And then the other way that you can save money is to trade services. If you have some sort of service you can offer the editor, which is something Dennis and I have done before. We've traded services. Not all editors are open to that. You'll have a better shot at doing that if you know them already and are not just someone contacting them out of nowhere.
Mm-hmm.
But things like, covers, if your editor is also a writer, you can trade a cover design for a part of an edit, something like that.
Okay, so yeah, just to kind of sum up, you can kind of save some. You could save some money or save some of the steps if one, you develop good relationships in like a group, either online or offline, and you kind of exchange books back and forth. And if you just simply work on your English, like if you have a really good command of the English language in terms of the writing, but if you write someone like someone like me who almost failed high school English, I need a copy edit. I need a dev edit. I need a copy edit. I need proofreading. I need the whole thing. I need it professionally. Okay, that's great. I think we answered all the questions. I don't see any other questions there. So the last question that I have for you is how should, and this one we didn't really talk about beforehand, but I think it's kind of important to talk about. How should people take criticism? And not really criticism, but like how should people take suggestions from an editor? Because I know a lot of people, and myself too, like you write a book and your heart is in the book, right? Like it's essentially a piece of you. So how should you take some criticism, and not necessarily just from editor, but like say you gave away an advanced review copy, right? And someone just was not happy with it all. What kind of tips do you have for people to deal with that?
Yeah, so my first tip is don't make any decisions until you've had a couple days to digest your feedback. So don't decide to take it or leave it until you can let it sink in. That is something that I do when I get feedback, and it's something I tell my clients to do. Because sometimes our first reaction is to like raise our hackles and be like, no, I don't agree with that at all. And then you spend a day and you're like, well, maybe they have a point. The other thing too to look at when you receive feedback is it helpful or is it not helpful? If it's helpful, then you might give it some more of your time. And if it's just someone stating their opinion, then you might just have to leave that. If it's from an editor, it should be helpful, but sometimes it's not. And then 2, if you're working with an editor or a beta reader, vetting them ahead of time can help, because if you trust and respect the person who's giving you the feedback, it can be easier to take than if it's someone who you haven't built that relationship with yet. Yeah, and then 2, remember at the end of the day, you're the author, not them. So it's always your final decision.
Yes.
And you can choose to take it or not. You can choose to say, yes, I see you have a point, but I'm going to change it in a different way than you suggested. So it's always the author's decision.
So I guess don't be afraid to tell them to F off.
Yeah.
And say, thank you for your feedback. And then you turn around and you don't do anything. And like, you know, in like kind of protective of your story way, right? Jessica wanted to clarify, until I can afford a reputable editor, that is. Yeah, I'm not entirely sure what that means. Like, I'm not sure if she's referring to like, Jess, if you can just clarify. I'm not sure if
I think she's referring to asking what she can do before she can pay for an editor.
Okay. And did we cover that?
We did, but I would also add, this is a scary number, but if you're starting from scratch, you're just barely starting to write, I tell people to try and budget $5,000 for their book release, which should cover your editing, your covers, your first launch marketing stuff, buying a good number of author copies, all of that. If you can budget $5,000, you will have a lot of room to work with. And so just that's something to work towards. It's not possible for everyone.
But yeah, if you take the steps that we kind of talked about in terms of saving money by increasing your competence with the trade in terms of writing, and joining writing groups and creating relationships within those groups with maybe some like-minded people or some people that also write in the same genre as you. Judy. Yeah, so you can find, if you would like to learn more about Caitlin's services, she does have Ignited Ink Writing. Okay. All right. Well, ignitedinkwriting.com. You can check her out. You can sign up for her monthly writing prompt. You can also check her out on YouTube. She has a YouTube channel. And I'm just going to bring you back in the stream because it's kind of awkward, me just talking about you without there. There we are. You can also check her out. She does YouTube videos as well. So thank you very much for joining us, Caitlin. That was, I think, a lot of great information for people to have.
Good. I'm glad to help.
Good. All right. And if anyone else has any more questions, if you're watching this on the replay, certainly leave a comment below. Caitlin is part of the group as well, and her or I will do our best to answer the questions in a timely fashion. Other than that, I hope you enjoy the rest of your Friday evening, and cheers.